Do you see political fiction as pushing the truth? Can this fiction be called propaganda? And what do you think about political fiction as a genre?
So to be honest, I find the term political fiction a bit misleading. I think when we say social fiction, for instance, what we mean by social is clear. It's fiction that is dealing thematically with social issues. But when we say political fiction, the term political can be read as both the subject of the work and also as the ideological tendency of the work. So it's a little bit ambiguous, right? So, I mean, one is I would just prefer to refer to novels like Quarterlife as fiction about politics rather than political fiction. And of course, it's a different argument to which, to what extent one is the other. For example, there are also many social fictions that are deeply political. The other thing that you asked is about propaganda, which, at least to my mind, is a completely different venture altogether. It's not a venture that is vested in truth other than through narrow political ends. And propaganda may very well get peddled as political fiction. But I think the moment that happens, the narrative really ceases to be literature, right? It ceases to carry the power that literature does. And in that sense, it becomes no different from the political manifesto. To give you an example, I think one thing that the novel does that the political manifesto cannot do is to hold many different points of view. And that's not to say that the novel is neutral or that it's unbiased. Some people have asked me that, how do you keep bias out of the process when you're capturing so many points of view in a book like Quarterlife? And, do you have a politics? And of course I do, as a citizen, as a voter, as a protester, as anyone who has lived in this country for the past decade and spent so much time thinking about democracy, that politics is going to be inescapable. And it's impossible to hide it when you're writing across 400 pages. And it's also, I personally don't think it's terribly desirable that we hide it. There's a beautiful line by Walter Benjamin in his essay, The Author as Producer, where he says that there's no difference between the moral and the literary tendency of a work. But I think what the novel form does do that is very special is that even while this moral tendency, if we can call it that, exists in the form of an undercurrent through the work, the novel allows the writer to hold space for several other points of view. And I mean extensive space. Quarterlife as a novel is, it's wider, it's more intelligent, and it's more complex than I am as a person or a citizen. And one of the reasons is that through all the years I was researching the book, I had to constantly push myself to be, to sort of put aside my own opinions in order to be able to observe more clearly the people around me. And hopefully, by extension, books like that also encourage the reader to pause and to observe the society around them well. And while I can't speak to Quarterlife being my own book, when I think of other books that I have read that attempt to do this and do it well, their value lies in the fact that if we observe well as a society, we will judge well as a society. And if we judge well as a society, we will act well as a society. And in the final lap, obviously, the political manifesto will be far more effective than in the novel. But in the first lap, the novel will be more effective than the manifesto. And if the two collapse into each other, we would all just be the poorer for it.
So, would it have been a bother if you were to write a piece like Quarterlife in Hindi during times like now?
If by bother you mean a personal threat to my security, as the writer, as a person, then yes, there's no doubt that writing in English and writing fiction, as opposed to, say, nonfiction or political treatise, offers you some degree of protection. Not a huge lot, since it doesn't take anything for a vigilante to pick up some one sentence from the book and go crazy with it. But there's no doubt, I think, that those who are writing in regional languages are a lot more vulnerable. I don't think that Gauri Lankesh would have got shot if she was writing in English, and she made a choice not to do so in order to achieve a certain kind of impact. It's very admirable. and brave. And it's not to say that I write in English because it felt safe. I wrote in English because that is the language that I was raised in, since my parents have different mother tongues. And it's also the language that I went to school in, and the one that I feel most articulate in, even though, I've lived in India for almost all my life. And I mean, the question I have is, if I were to switch out of this language, not as an activist or a political figure who needs to think a lot about contingency, but just as an artist, like what other language would feel authentic to me? Because, English might speak to a certain kind of hegemony, but so does Hindi if you're writing a story set in Maharashtra, right? And so does Marathi, because what about all the people who live here who don't speak it? Like my mom, who, her mother tongue is Konkani. And so in order to stick to the truth of sort of my existence here, which is that I speak Indian English, which is different from English is spoken anywhere else in the world. That was the language I was going to use for the text. And of course, I would love for the book to be translated into Hindi and Marathi. And, if there are consequences to that translation, just so be it, because the day we internalize fear as artists, we're just finished, right? Like, as they say, for every book that is actually burnt, thousands more will never get written. So I think that's certainly an eventuality we'd all like to avoid, as an artist, as a literary community.
Does patriotism or general love towards country mean your approval towards the nation state as a construct?
I mean, first there's just the question of patriotism, right? Like, what is it? What does it mean in the context of being a writer? And I think there has been a lot of reference to Quarterlife as an India book or a Bombay book. And that's always, sometimes it's a bit of surprise to me, since I don't think India or Mumbai ever like visited me as some kind of muse, or that I was writing, some kind of love letter to the city or the country that was begging to be written off, for me at least, the country, the city, it's always been just a frame, like a kind of case study through which I wanted to explore something much more universal about human nature, just, whether it's the psychology underlying our current political discourse or the moral roots of certain political positions. And, and so that's why I did a lot of research, and over time, it is true that over time I started to feel a love for the places that I was writing about. To say it's writing about the whole country would again be a kind of hubris, but whatever locations that I was writing about, and by that I don't mean patriotism in the sense that I saw these places as belonging to me or me as belonging to them. I think love for me is not about laying a claim to anything, right? It's a quality of attention. Like, love is to give something all of your time and your energy and your attention for the best years of my life. And now retrospectively, when I look back, do I love the places that I've written off? The answer is yes. Not because I think these are good or bad things, but just because of what my actions say about, how I've chosen to spend my time in my life. And then, I think the question of whether that love necessarily means, an approval of the nation state, right?
I mean, it does get like, I find it very interesting right now because friends around me, there are many different opinions on what it really means to be patriotic right now. Like I know friends who are like extreme on the left spectrum, who think that the current government is not working for them, is very harsh. And I have also friends who are, for them patriotism is just defending the current government, and that 2024 should be a Modi leadership again. And if you are not in favor of that, then you are not really patriotic. So right now I find it very complex. And when I read Quarterlife, I've been constantly recommending it to people in my college, in my class, where I think there's much more perspective and substance to what patriotism is in your book. That's why I wanted to ask this.
So, I mean, one is, of course, we don't want to conflate one particular government with the nation state as a construct, right? I think that gives
Okay, yes.
that gives that government or that party or whatever it is, just way too much power.
Yes.
Um, but I think that that underlying question of does patriotism mean approval of just the nation state as it stands? I mean, I think there's no doubt that the nation state, just as a construct, whether we're talking about India or any other, is under immense pressure to justify itself today, right? Like, global finance and the flow of information on the internet, and these, it cares nothing for national borders. And we're also in the midst right now of a global refugee crisis where millions have been stripped of any sense of a kind of national home or citizenship. And this whole
Mm.
hope that was maybe there post the colonial era, that this system of government would award people with great equality and dignity, I think even it got us somewhere. But I think that that ideal is, you mentioned somewhere later in your questions, and I'm sure we'll come to that, the idea of a utopia, right? And everything that democracy could have done for us. And that's also coming into crisis now. It's been eroding.
Mm.
But one of the dangers that I feel, is that the trouble with losing faith in the nation state altogether is that, we don't have any kind of alternative yet. And this exhaustion that you talk about, this hopelessness, this fatigue, that we feel with this construct and where it can take us, is one of the reasons why I think authoritarian and populist governments are becoming so popular. And they're making use of our exhaustion. And so the irony is that just as our faiths in the nation state fades, the worst kind of nationalist tendencies are growing stronger, right? And so what I would say is that or what I believe personally is that until we can find a better solution to the nation state as a way to achieve some kind of collective freedom and some kind of common good, as an individual, I would rather continue to push, for example, for the idea that a nation state is rooted in its constitution rather than an ancient collective past that makes some people insiders and some people outsiders. Or I would push as a citizen, as a writer, as a student, for a country where the rule of law is what defines my nation, as opposed to an authoritarian government who controls the courts. And so this is something that I discuss often with my students as well in APU, which is say that deconstruction is extremely important. It's vitally important. And it's one of those, it's a kind of intelligence one comes into after coming into a liberal arts education. And, I would not, I would only encourage that deeply. But I also think there is a need for us to think a little bit about what it looks like to build things, to construct things. This is very hard to do, what it looks like to build healthier systems of government, healthier institutions, a healthier society. And I think until such time as we have no alternative to the nation state, we need to demand both. One, that we get the healthiest governments that we can. And on the other hand, that we don't get so caught up in this idea of national politics that we ignore the toxic side of these macro forces, that I spoke of, that thoroughly undermine our national boundaries. So, yeah, that's what I would say. I think
Interesting.
with your friends, yeah.
Um, okay. Do you think the world is fundamentally based on violence? Because even for something as basic as food, most beings require to kill others.
I mean, I was curious when I saw that question. What you think? Do you think the world is fundamentally based on is that sort of the rationale, or
No,
because you seem like someone who has a questing side and an altruistic side, some of the greater good in mind. So I'm curious what you felt.
um, I don't necessarily agree with this, like the the speed of this question. It was written by Arav. He was unable to join today. He also studies at APU.
Sure. Oh, lovely.
And yeah, and he wanted to, like, he believes that the society right now and the society previously, it has always been structured in a way that violence will always dominate, or violet will always, like, come first in the race if it's running against love. And he thinks that
Mm.
if during the times of danger, everyone's going to turn against each other. If, like, he also talked about, if India destroys its democracy, then it's
Mm.
not going to be the government then that's going to kill its people. It's just going to be its people who are going to kill each other. And his views are very sharp in that context. So he wanted to ask you, what do you think about that? That like, what would happen if do you think that world is fundamentally based on violence in that way, in that sense?
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that when I look around me, the world does contain both sort of elements of cooperation. By world, I mean people, human beings. You see elements of cooperation and you see conflictual elements, right? And I think to take hold of only one of those as fundamental to our nature could be a very dangerous track to take. I mean, I don't know that we have evidence. All these state of nature debates, when they came up in Western philosophy, they weren't exactly based on some kind of empirical evidence. It was more just, what if we assume your friend is right, right? What if we, like what your friend is saying essentially is what the philosopher Hobbes was saying, which is basically to say that man is violent and selfish by nature. And the result is that we must have a strong central authority. Otherwise, we are going to slip into chaos or violence. And, we don't even, the government doesn't matter. Indians will kill Indians and all of that. But one of the flip sides of thinking that way is that many authoritarian governments derive their legitimacy from such an argument. They are convinced that without them, we would be at each other's throat. And one of the problems of such an argument is that it does not give, citizens enough credit for certain human tendencies, like having a conscience, like being altruistic. I mean, there is a neural circuit in our brains that rewards us with a little burst of dopamine every time we are generous to other people. And so I think it's, whether or not your friend is right or, the counter view is right, I think a pessimistic view of human nature could run the danger of investing more in weapons than in schools that believe that we can teach human beings to be kinder and more civil. And so one of the ways to think about such an argument is just not what is the opening assumption and whether that holds or not, but if you see it through, where does it land, and is that where we want to land? But what do you think? What do you feel about what your friend said?
I don't necessarily agree. Like I'm a very I'm very idealistic in that sense. I don't want this kind of world where violence prevails over love.
Hmm.
I think, and I do believe that like love is love is a great thing. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the world is fundamentally based on violence. People would help each other if there were times, if it was the times of emergency. I don't know.
Mm.
So
I mean, I don't know if you've read him yet, but the philosopher you're sounding like is Rousseau. If we believe that man is inherently good and cooperative by nature, and
yeah.
for him, the social contract didn't mean giving up your freedom to a higher authority in exchange for their protection, but that you come together as a people to create a government that represents the common good that you wish to achieve. And
Yes.
and I want to believe that. Trust me, I do. I was very idealistic. I still am very idealistic, but I think if I had met you when I was in college myself, we would have felt very similarly about the world. But just to play devil's advocate, I'm an Indian woman. I simply have to step outside the wall of my residential society, at night to know
Hmm.
that Hobbes isn't off the mark, right? The sight of that police chowki, one day if the lights are off there, I feel that shiver on my neck as I'm crossing the road. And the
Hmm.
moment that light comes on and that the chowki is there, it gives me the sense of calm. So in some
Hmm.
sense, I think it isn't either or. It's just that we maybe need to take a more sort of balanced view of human nature. And I think and I think on a case-to-case basis, you probably need to rationalize where either of these arguments is going to lead you.
Hmm.
But that's what I would think.
And yes, of course, you are right. Like in rationality, in practicality, like we would have to have a balanced opinion, not to be on the either extreme of it. Like not to believe that violence is only the key or love is only the key. You are right.
Yeah,
But personally, I I just like the idea of I just like idealism a lot, like a lot, a lot.
it's a
It
beautiful. May you never lose it.
Yeah, but I think with age one starts to lose it, right? Like many people around me tell me that once you are about 25, 26, you start to lose hopes for communism. You don't look at it the same way, and the world changes, and that all it just depresses me. It depresses the fuck out of me.
I mean, it gets harder. I'll say, like, I think the 20s. How old are you now?
I'm 19.
Okay, so I do think what happens. So the quarter life, when I was writing that book, it's essentially about that age, right? It's the 20s
Yes.
where you're almost not allowed to have the kind of idealism that you had in college because you're running up against all these real world choices. You're going to take a corporate job. How does that sit with your politics? You're going to have to feed a family. How does that sit with your politics? You're going to have to vote, and neither option is going to be exciting. How does that sit with your politics? And so there are these negotiations that you're going to make over the coming decade.
Yeah.
Um, but my feeling about that is, just because one can't have that absolutely kind of, I don't know, pure ideal doesn't
Mm,
mean that you can't have anything. Like
mm,
there's always room for degrees. And I know that it's hard to keep faith in the future when we have so much going on around us, right? In Palestine and Manipur, just the kind of laws that target minorities that are being passed in the country right now.
mm,
And I think at times like that, I think of this line in a poem. I'm actually forgetting the title of the poem, but it's a poem by Wisława Sambriowska, and it's not a poem about politics. It's a poem about death. And she says, "In vain, death pulls at the door. As far as you have come, cannot be undone." And
mm,
I tend to think of maybe of a bleak future in the same way. Like even if one unjust citizenship law is not implemented tomorrow because your protests pushed it, the fact that it is implemented 2 years down the line, it doesn't undo that maybe even like a few people got their papers in that much time and are cannot be sort of persecuted by it. And of course we have to keep trying, but in that process, every single child saved, every small act of kindness, every moment of relief gained can never be undone by the fact that greater failure or loss was coming in the future. It's already
mm.
a victory. Nothing can undo it. It just stands forever in time. And
Yes.
that gives me faith, I think, as an adult,
Mm,
that even if some of the idea of a complete utopia that one had in youth has eroded, there are
huh.
still there are still gains to be had.
Yes.
And I would
And
I would hope to
and
keep pushing for those.
yes, yes. And before I ask the seventh question, earlier you talked about writing fiction. I
Yeah.
just want to read out two lines from your book, which I find very beautiful. And like those two lines were the reason why I came out of a writing block and I started writing my essays and I started writing all the things that I was writing. These lines are so beautiful in my mind. I don't know, it just connects to me very well.
I'm so
And
happy to hear that. Yeah, please.
yes, and the first one is uh it's the way you write it. You write this sense that he's at the cusp of an era and wants to be at the center when it all comes together. To be
Mm.
at the center and to be young. This is so beautiful. And when I read this, I was like, I have to complete this book tonight. Tonight, I have to complete this because I cannot wait more to see what's written in here. And the other was, and this is what I like about your book. It's the humor part of the book which I like very much. Like normally, the books that I've read which are surrounding this topics, and I don't want to compare it to anything, but it's just the humor that's it's very true. And the line is, I just found him really funny, like he stepped right out of a Wes Anderson film. Everyone laughs, including I, who has never seen a Wes Anderson film, but gets the idea. So yeah, so and there are many lines like this in the book. That's why I like Quarterlife a lot. And I just wanted to insert here just to let you know that I'm a big fan of your writing, aside from everything.
Thank you, Kunal. It means a lot. The book was a long time in the making, and it really, in fiction, the writer doesn't complete the book. It's completed by the reader. It's how you make meaning
Mm.
of it and how you bring your imagination to it and take it forward that that both completes the book and by extension brings, I don't know, the deepest sense of fulfillment to the writer. So thank you for making meaning with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now the seventh question. Do
Sure.
you think trust in people is necessary to create an utopia? Does imagining an ideal world require you to make the assumption that no one will be in pursuit of greater power for themselves? If so, then how do you make that assumption living in a world that is so flawed? And if it's not, then how else do you imagine utopia? And if you don't imagine utopia, then what do you strive to achieve? Where do you find hope for the future?
I think it's exactly in that Bislava line, right? I don't think I'm at a point where I can articulate what a utopia looks like. And I think moments like this make it very hard when you're seeing the daily headlines every day. It's almost like forget utopia. How do you get aid to people who are starving? How do you get aid to pregnant women who are starving in Gaza? How do you try and heal, how do you the situation that's happening? It becomes so much more, and forget even internationally, right? Like just domestically, there's so much to push for. And I think what happens when you commit yourself in some ways to it, the cause almost doesn't matter. You find your cause. I mean, it doesn't have to be Manipur or Gaza, or you find where a cause that gives you a sense of purpose, and also how you will engage with it, right? Not all writers are activists, not all activists are lawyers, not all lawyers are politicians. And all of these they're almost like different parts of a mind. Each have something to bring to a cause, to a movement, to a healthier society. And one need not feel pressure to do the work of all the others, but you can achieve a lot by just doing your own task well, and doing it in a spirit of democratic values, of kindness, of
Hmm.
human rights. One of the
Yeah.
things that struck me when I was interviewing young boys on the right wing is that one of the reasons I thought the Hindu nationalist ideology was so effective was also because the institutions propagating it don't expect everyone to be an activist. There isn't too much internal shaming of that kind. There is a lot of there. It's very understood that you can belong to any walk of life as a person and still contribute by exhibiting certain values and committing yourself to certain ends and keeping some time in your day towards those ends. Now, unfortunately, I find all of those ends extremely nefarious, but I think something, I think I do think that one could take a page from that book. Like, I don't think all of us, I don't think everybody can be an activist. I don't think everybody can be a writer. But no matter what choices you make in the next 10 years, even if you choose to start a small business, even if you just choose to be a family man, there is room to embody the values that you currently believe in, and to push, however incrementally, for their embodiment in actual causes and outcomes in the world, even if it's something as small as segregating your trash. So I think that it's sort of one shouldn't lose sight of the bigger picture, but that doesn't mean
Hmm.
one loses sight of the immediate either. Like kind of always being fixed on the kind of horizon, and then feeling this kind of despair till you're immobile and eating a packet of chips and sort of depositing the bag on the road doesn't really get us anywhere either, right? And
Hmm.
so I don't know where life will take you, but I hope that some of this continues to be a guiding light in actions large and small. And there's also I also think people these days talk about solidarity networks, which is a really wonderful way to contribute to things, to ends that are meaningful, um, which wasn't a part of my imagination when I was a young person. So when I was younger, I remember listening to an interview by Samantha Powers, and she said, another young person asked her, like, what do you suggest I do? Because there's so many causes and I don't know which one to align myself to. And like every day there's something new in the news that really gets to me, and I feel so helpless because I can't attend to it all. And she just says, you pick one and you give it your best and try and make some little change in that domain. And that is adequate. And there were years and years that I held on to that idea that, okay, if I'm a writer and if I'm writing something of value on a subject that means a lot to me, that's enough. But I think these days there's a newer way of thinking about it, which a very dear friend of mine who's an activist explained to me. And that is, he said that there's a lot to be gained from solidarity networks, from people of different walks of life and with different networks coming together to support a particular humanitarian crisis or moment. And so what he said is, you spend 80% of your time doing what you have to do, but try and keep a little bit of that time and energy open to just lending solidarity to all the other causes that might feed into that idea of that beautiful world that you carry right now. And so these are new ways of thinking. These are ways of thinking that we are learning from you. I see my students do this much more naturally and effectively than some of us, the older generation do. So, we look forward to learning from you.
Yeah, nice. And I think all the questions have ended, and I think you speak very nice, and I can hear you as long as you can speak because you speak so beautifully.
Oh,
And
from the
I'm
heart.
going.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the engagement.
Yes, and before we say bye, there's one of my friend. She told me to tell you this. She attended one of your PUCL talks, and she loved your discussion on composites. She told me to tell you that she works as an intern at ALF under Arvind Narayan. If
Okay.
you ask where she's from or where she works, who she works under, but she told me that she loved your talk on that when we told her that you are going to come on the podcast and talk about several questions.
I'm so glad to hear that. It was a really wonderful talk. It was about human rights and the novel, and Arvind was there. This was basically around Akar Patel's book After Messiah, which is also
Okay.
a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book, and I'm particularly going to recommend it since we've been talking so much about idealism. It's about a dictator who dies of a heart attack, and then the person who comes to power is somebody who, in my mind, seemed like a composite of Aruna Roy and Arundhati Roy, and she's like this
Oh.
powerful woman activist who's had kind of, she's been a lawyer, but she fights for these causes, and now she wants to pass this law. And she wants to get this law passed during her period as prime minister, that's going to return the land rights to some tribals whose lands have been snatched in the name of development. And the question that comes up is, the ends are undoubtedly noble, right? We can't
Yeah.
deny that through the book. But how far will you let go of your values in terms of the means to get there? Because to work through politics is to work through innumerable compromises in order to see something happen. And so that is the struggle at the heart of that book. And I think, I don't want to give away the ending, but the way it's resolved in the end, just a deeply spiritual end of that protagonist's journey was something I found very moving and might actually speak to some of the things we've talked about today. So I hope you read
Mm.
After Messiah by Akar Patel. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
wonderful.
I'll definitely read that now.
Uh,
And yes, and I think we should end it here.
all
It's it
right.
was it was it was very we are very grateful that you came and talked with us.
It was really a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Kunal.